Sarin is an extremely dangerous chemical weapon. Before I introduce you its development, let me show you a declassified test video.
A series of 9 separate field tests were conducted at the Chemical Corps Proving Ground, Dugway, Utah, to demonstrate and to evaluate the penetration of GB nerve gas into hard targets. Test animals, whose resistance to GB is comparable to or slightly higher than man's, were placed in targets of varying hardness. Targets included a sandbagged machine gun position, a 2-man covered foxhole, a hasty fortification, and a concrete command post bunker. Almost 4,000 yards away, a battery of 155mm howitzers prepared to fire standard GB-filled shells at the target complex. On command, all 6 pieces were fired. The visible cloud is burnt powder and dust kicked up by the bursting shells. GB itself is invisible in air. The howitzers were reloaded and fired as quickly as possible to put 6 more rounds on the target. Within 15 seconds, 75 pounds of GB had been dispersed. These scenes were filmed simultaneously by remote control cameras in each separate location and have been shortened to conserve the running time of the film. The animals in the machine gun position were the first to be affected. Although protected from blast and shell fragments, by the time the smoke and dust had cleared away, the pigeon in the foreground was dead from the effects of the nerve gas. Less than 40 seconds had elapsed. The pigeon in the 2-man foxhole also has died in less than 40 seconds. The rabbit and goat showed symptoms in less than a minute and were dead in less than 4 minutes. The sampling equipment in each position measures the concentration of GB that penetrates the fortification. The animals in the hasty bunker began to react to the GB in less than 2 minutes and were dead within 3 minutes. The goat in the machine gun position has now expired. It is less than 3 minutes since the shells landed. The effects of the nerve gas on the 2 goats in the command post bunker were evident in less than 2 minutes. Fortified positions of this kind are so sturdy that anything less than direct hits with high explosive shells from medium artillery probably would fail to cause any casualties. None of the test animals were killed or even injured by blast or shell fragments. All the animals were killed by the toxic chemical within 4 minutes after the GB shells landed in the target area. It must be recognized, of course, that with troops occupying hard targets such as these, GB casualties would be minimized if the men were properly masked before the toxic cloud enveloped them. These tests demonstrated how quickly lethal concentrations of GB nerve gas can penetrate hard targets and fortifications of the type that normally provide considerable protection from high explosive.
Sarin gas was discovered accidentally by Gerhard Schrader, a German chemist who had been tasked with developing new insecticides. After several setbacks, Schrader began to experiment with molecules that combined phosphorus and cyanide. An early candidate was so poisonous that exposure to trace amounts sent Schrader to the hospital for several weeks. Finally, he created a dramatic poison. Dilute solutions destroyed insect food pests and also caused vomiting, shortness of breath, pupil dilation, drooling, sweating, and death in apes and other mammals. Given the molecule's toxicity, the management of his company alerted the German military high command about this new compound. At the northwest edge of Berlin lies the imposing 16th century Spandau citadel. Today, it hosts musical concerts, weddings, and fairs. But in the 1930s, the citadel hosted a suite of scientists developing chemical weapons secretly in direct contravention to the peace treaty of Versailles. The site employed about 300 scientists and technicians working on chemical weapons, including animal testing, munitions development, and development of the manufacturing processes. When German army scientists at the Spandau citadel first analyzed Schrader's development, they were so impressed that they named it Tabun, after the German word for taboo. Existing chemical weapons such as mustard gas took hours to days to kill victims, but Tabun required only 20 minutes. The army was so impressed that they gave Schrader and his colleagues a 50,000 mark reward, about $20,000 at the time, for the discovery. A few years later, in 1938, Schrader synthesized a new nerve agent that was twice as toxic as Tabun. The poison was renamed Sarin, an acronym built from the last names of the scientists who had spearheaded its development: Schrader, Otto Ambros, Gerhard Ritter, and Hans-Jürgen von der Linde. As World War II started, the German scientists tested aerial bombs containing Tabun and discovered that the most deadly way to deploy the agent was to use a small detonation to disperse it as a mist. By the spring of 1943, a few years into the war, the first large-scale Tabun factory near Diehenfurt was created in the southern part of Poland. The plant began production in 1942. The plant produced initially shells and aerial bombs. Large-scale manufacturing of the agent resulted in problems with the product's degradation over time, and only around 12,000 tons of material were manufactured before the plant was overrun by the advancing Red Army. Despite all the effort expended on Tabun, by the war's midpoint it was becoming increasingly clear that military researchers that sarin was a much better chemical weapon. Sarin was more volatile and toxic, even though it was more challenging to manufacture. So in 1943, the German military approved the construction of a new sarin factory at Falkenhagen, a site approximately 50 kilometers east of Berlin. In early 1945, as the Allies continued to gain ground on German territory, the German army went to extremes to hide their Tabun and sarin-filled munitions, which are presumably not known to the enemy and must under no circumstances fall into their hands. But transporting these munitions to more secure areas was a real challenge, in part because many railroad tracks had been bombed and the country was under frequent Allied airstrikes. As the Red Army approached to Germany's eastern borders in the spring of 1945, they discovered the sarin production plant. And once they found out about the new nerve agents, they disassembled the factory and reassembled it in the Soviet Union. The British Army also discovered a bounty of files about the Spandau Citadel's Chemical Weapons Research Center. As Allied scientists discovered that some German munitions contained a potent, unknown nerve agent that was much more toxic than anything they had in their own inventory, they began to scramble to get their hands on the military spoils. Soon the Americans and the British pooled resources and began searching for the rounding up scientists involved in chemical weapons research. When they arrested Tabun inventor Schrader at his home, he immediately handed over chemical formulas and other details of the nerve agents. When the American and British intelligence discovered that the Russians had rebuilt the sarin plant in the Soviet territory, there was no doubt that a chemical weapons arms race began in the middle of the 1940s.